everyone, and welcome back to Front-End Expert. In this video, we're going to be discussing images and how we can use them in CSS, and when we should use them in CSS instead of the HTML image tag. And at the core of this discussion is the question, are images content or are they style? If they are content, then they belong in the HTML, since that's the markup of our content. But if they are style, then they belong in the CSS, since that is our style sheet. And this is actually going to be the deciding factor that we will be using. Images in HTML should be considered part of the content. If removing an image from the page would change the meaning of the content in any substantial way, then that image probably belongs in the HTML as an image tag. However, if removing the image has no effect on the meaning of the page, then that image likely is just styling information and might belong in the CSS. That said, these aren't absolute rules, and you should always be using your best judgment. Okay, so then how do we actually create an image using CSS? Well, the primary way to do this is with the background image property, which takes a URL function as the value. This function then takes in a path to the image, which can be either relative or absolute. Background image then sets the image to the background of that element, so it will go behind the content if the element has any content. In addition to this background image property, there are also a few properties that can be used to affect the way this background image is rendered. First, the background clip defines where the image will be clipped off or cropped from based on the box model. For example, setting the value to padding box causes the background to extend just outside of the padding, but not to the edge of the border. Similarly, border box would extend to the outside of the border, while content box will only be the size of the actual content. You can also set the value to just text, and the background will only be around the text, but we don't tend to use that one too often because it just doesn't have a lot of use cases. It's also worth noting that the background clip property also works for background colors if we want those to extend to a different portion of the box model. Similarly, background origin sets where the background starts. For example, with padding box, the top left corner of the background image will be the top left corner of the padding. Usually we will end up setting this to the same value as the background clip, but not always. It's also worth noting that the background origin differs in that it cannot have text as a value. Next, background repeat specifies if the background should repeat if the element is larger than the background image. And finally, background size specifies the size of the image. Usually we specify this as two space-separated values, with the first being the width and the second being the height. A value of auto here will scale up the image while keeping its proportions so the aspect ratio doesn't change. Additionally, we can use the values of contain or cover. Cover will scale the image as large as possible, just stretching to fill the container, then cropping out any portions that end up outside of the element. And contain will make the image as large as possible without cropping it or changing the proportions. Now finally, let's take a look at image spriting. And this is the process of including multiple images in a single image file and then splitting up that file on the client before displaying it to the user. Since the client needs to download less files, this can be a great option to be more bandwidth efficient, but at the same time, it can make the code less readable, so there's definitely a trade-off. To actually use the images, you would then use the background position property to get the individual images out of the larger image. This is a property intended to move the background inside of the image container, but combined with some clever sizing on the element, it can also be used to just use a certain portion of the image that you want. And this is great for this image spriting use case. So now let's move over to the code editor and do a quick demo of how this all works. So now we have moved over to the code editor. Let's take a quick look at this demo. So at the top we have an H1 with the text of images, and then we have a div with the ID of AlgoExpert. Below that is some commented out code, but we will take a look at that in a moment. For now, we are just going to focus on this AlgoExpert div. And if we look at the styles.css, you can see the AlgoExpert div is being selected. We give it a width and a height of 300 and 200 pixels respectively. We also gave it a 10 pixel dashed black border and 10 pixels of padding. And most importantly, we've given it a background image of algoexpert.png, which is a local file I have with the AlgoExpert logo. But the first thing you might notice here is that the logo doesn't fit in the box. So it's overflowing and essentially just being cropped so we can only see the top left of the logo. So to fix this, we can set a background size. And what background size does is it allows us to change the X and Y size of the image. So for example, I could set it to 100 pixels by 100 pixels. And now you see we end up with a bunch of these background images because it repeats by default. And 100 by 100 is smaller than the size of the Algo Expert div. We can also use the keywords we have seen here. So I could say contain, and what contain is going to do is stretch it as large as it possibly can without having to crop or change the proportions of the image. So here we end up stretching it to, I believe, about 200 by 200. I believe this is a square image. And then it is adding a second version of it to the right where it is repeating to fill out the rest of the container. We can also set this to cover, and this will fill out the entirety of the container with however big it has to make it. But then what it's going to do is it's just going to crop the rest of it out. So in this case, since the algoexpert.png file has a different aspect ratio than the size of this div, it's getting cropped at the bottom. So for now, let's go back to a background size of contain, and let's take a look at the repeating background. So we can change that as well by using the background repeat property. So background repeat, and we will set this to no repeat. And what this says is that we only want one copy of this background image. We don't want it to tile and create more copies of it. And next, we can change the background clip and the background origin to decide where this image is going to start. So for example, I can say background origin, and we can set this to either border box, content box, or padding box. So for example, let's set this to the border box, and now the image is starting at the top left of the border rather than starting inside of the border. And similarly, we can set the background clip value. So for example, if I set this to just the content box, then what's going to happen is even though the image is starting at the top left, so at the top of the border, it is getting clipped to the size of the content. So what's happening here is we're actually losing the edges of this image because they're getting clipped, because the background clip is smaller than the background origin box. So usually we end up with these being the same value. So for example, we might want to make this the border box so that they are the same, or we could make them both, say, the padding box, and this will be inside of the border. Okay, so that's how we can use the background image properties. But now what I want to look at is how we can take advantage of this spriting concept that we looked at earlier. So if we go back to the HTML, and let's uncomment out this code, and what we have here is an image that is sprites.png, and this has the HTML and the CSS logos. So the blue logo on the left is the CSS3 logo, whereas the orange logo on the right is the HTML5 logo. And then we have these two sections, each with an H2 of HTML and CSS, and then they each have a div, one with the ID of HTML and one with the ID of CSS. And what I want to do is to make these different divs, so the HTML div and the CSS div, have the images from this sprited image, rather than just using the IMG tag and seeing both of them next to each other like the sprite file has them. So to do this, let's go back to the styles.css file, and let's start with the HTML image. So I will do the HTML ID, and this image has a size of 256 pixels by 256 pixels. And this is something I just know. If you've created this sprited file like I created this one, you would just need to know what the size of the different images are and the exact locations of those images. And next we need to set the background image. So let's do background image, and we will set this to the URL of the sprites.png file. And next we need to set the background position. And background position will be used to move the HTML logo over because it's currently on the right, but we need to push it over to the left to be on the far left of the image to align with our actual div. So the values we will use here is something that you should just know based on having created the sprite. In this case, we need negative 286 pixels and then negative 10 pixels. And when I save this, you'll see we get the HTML5 logo under the HTML text. Okay, great. So now we can do the same thing with the CSS. So we can say CSS, this has the same width and height, so 256 pixels by 256 pixels. And we can set the same background image as well to the URL of sprites.png. And this one will have a background position of negative 10 pixels, negative 10 pixels. So we just need to move everything left 10 pixels and up 10 pixels. And when we save this under CSS, we now get this CSS logo, but they're both using the same image file. And then in the HTML, we can get rid of the image tag because we don't need it anymore. And now in our final output, we have this div with ID of HTML and div with ID of CSS, but these are being used as images. And now one final step we might want to take is to add an ARIA role to these. So if we have an image that we are just using from CSS, we should give it a role of IMG if this is an image that needs to be considered part of the content. And then we can also give it an ARIA label so that a screen reader would know what this is an image of. So in this case, this would be the HTML logo. And then we can come down to CSS and do the same thing. So we will set this to a role of IMG and give it an ARIA label of CSS logo. And with that, that's going to do it for this video on CSS images. It is sort of a gray area on when you should be using HTML versus CSS. Most of the time, you should probably just be using the IMG, the image tag within HTML, and then editing those tags using CSS just with the width and height properties. But occasionally, you will actually want to use the background image property within CSS for the purpose of a background image. Or you might use it for the purpose of image spriting if you want to minimize the number of files that the user needs to download to their computer to view your website. And with that, that's going to be the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.